Hello, I'm Ros Parker, and today we're going to be looking at drafting your digital policy. If we have a start with what we're doing with the Digital ACE project, as I said, I'm Ros Parker. I'm currently the principal of Southend Adult Community College, and we've been working on drafting digital policy. And actually, what we've looked at is best practice across the different providers and different groups. So the Digital ACE project has been set up to support adult community education providers as we develop our technology and the journey that we've been on during lockdown, and to develop and enhance capability and capacity, but keeping learners at the heart of everything we do, and still making sure that everything we try to deliver through new and innovative approaches is of high quality as well. So the purpose of this session is that by the end of this session, hopefully you'll be able to identify what is important to include in your digital policy, consider the actions required when you're implementing your digital policy, and start capturing the impact of your digital policy and when you need to review it. And quite a lot of people have said in these sessions, when should you review it and how often? And that will obviously depend, and we'll talk about it as we go through the slides. So first of all, just wanted to get a feel really for where you are on your journey so far. And quite often policy can feel daunting, don't quite know where to start. And then when you start, you feel like you've opened up a Pandora's box and all of a sudden you've got to include everything. So sometimes it can be quite a daunting thing. So just for a moment, I want you just to stop and reflect on where you are in terms of how confident you feel when you are drafting or writing your current digital policy. You may have one and you may be looking to update it, review it, but equally you may not have one and it may seem like a big task. But we're going to break it down into chunks, but just have a little think, have a little pause for a moment, see how confident you are on a scale of 1 to 10, where 0 is not very confident at all and 10 is you're feeling very confident. The next question is around how confident are you in implementing an action plan to deliver your digital policy so that it's a very real, very live document. And then finally, how confident are you in demonstrating the impact of your digital policy as well? So just have a little think about those for a minute, quick gauge of where you are, and then right at the end, we'll review and check in where you feel you are at the end of this too. Now we're kind of building this all around the education inspection framework, and in all of our policies we consider, okay, what's our intent when we're putting this into place, how are we implementing it, and what's the impact of this in helping us in our overarching approach. So I thought it might be helpful to start off with some top tips. Might feel less difficult when we actually break this down. So when drafting your digital policy, point one really is don't overcomplicate it. If it reads as a complicated document, then it's less likely to be used. So make sure it's user-friendly. Make sure that what you're putting in place is actually helpful for people and easy to implement. Otherwise, it won't ever get off the ground. Don't start from scratch. There's plenty of good practice out there, plenty of examples, and you may even have one that you just need to adapt as well. So use what you've got, adapt it to fit the new context, or reach out to another colleague, peer, and see if they've got one and see if that works for you. Resist the temptation to include absolutely everything and cover everything in this policy. What I suggest you do is really think about some of the simple parts that you really need to incorporate into perhaps other policy documents. So rather than trying to cover every aspect of your day-to-day work within this policy, try and take some of this out and have a key link statement in other policies too, so you don't have to cover absolutely everything. Secure buy-in. Really important to work with others on a policy. The best way to get their buy-in is to work with people at a variety of levels so that you understand the impact of what you're trying to put into place when you're looking at a digital policy. And then, of course, make sure you get the relevant sign-off. And it does depend on your structure and how you're organised. It could be that you need to gain sign-off from governors or trustees, or in fact the council if you're part of a council. So just make sure it's in that cycle so that you can get the relevant sign off as well. Communicating the digital policy to staff and learners is really important in enabling them to understand their role in its implementation and how it impacts on them and their learners. So getting that buy-in and then being able to communicate about your digital policy to staff and learners is really critical, because that does help people to understand their role and the function they have in making things happen. So point 6 really is make sure your policies link but don't overlap. So it's going back to that point about don't try and cover absolutely everything in your digital policy, but just make sure that there are links, and you can just include key link statements so that each one does cross-reference back. Learn from your policy, because some things will work really well and others will need adapting, and that will be dependent on your own context. So when people have asked, when do I review it? It's always a good idea to review in a timely way. So you don't need to be doing this every week necessarily, but you also don't want to leave it a year. We can see the changes that have happened in our worlds in the last year, so you may need to review it a little bit more frequently. Equally, one of the purposes of reviewing it is to make sure that it's working for you. So you want the opportunity to reflect on what is working and adapt where things aren't. So really the number of times or how you review it is entirely up to you as an organisation and how your policy is working for you, so that you know that when you are reviewing it, you've clearly identified how effective the implementation is and what things need to be considered. In one of my sessions, we talked about perhaps initially a 3-month review to see how it's going, and then a 6-month review, and then of course the annual cycle. So again, that will be completely contextualized to your organisation and the resources that you have to do that. Ensure that your policy is within the policy cycle. So that's that bit about sign off. Then, you know, if you are in a situation where your policies need to be signed off by a governing body or a council, then there may be a specific timeline you have to fit into. So just make sure that you've got it built into that. The next part really is around including your most stringent key policy measures on your website, so that people understand what you're actually about and what the parameters and rules are around the policy you've implemented. Seek out peer support and best practice, and just make sure you're not sitting there on your own trying to work this through. There's plenty of people who have examples of really good practice in this area, and you know, this sector particularly has really excelled in marching on with their digital policy and its implementation. So what should be included in the digital policy? I'm going to go through a number of pointers, and the first two of these, the current context and an understanding of your reality. So, you know, what is in your current strategy, your current policy, and how relevant is that, and does it need adapting? If you don't have one, have a look at another digital policy and see what's in there, what's really absolutely essential for understanding your current context. To what extent does your policy provide parameters for your staff and learners to work from? Because that's what your policy is there to do: guide, set some rules, set some parameters. So how are your values reflecting changes in behaviour that you want to encourage through your policy? For example, how is it supporting your approach and the values and behaviours you expect when people are working remotely or learning remotely? What are you committing to by way of resources and equipment? It'd be great to have a really wonderful vision for what your digital policy is going to do, but you need to be able to resource it, and you need to be able to provide you know, necessary equipment. For example, if you're home working, what equipment do your staff have? And equally for learners, what are you committing to through your policy by way of resource and equipment? How well does your policy inform the curriculum? How does it support those in digital poverty? How does it support lower skilled learners? How does it support those with disabilities and learning difficulties? How does it support staff who may also fit into one of those groups as well? How well does your policy create a healthy and safe environment? One of the critical factors when we're looking at the current context and understanding the reality in which you work. So the second part is about a policy statement. The policy statement is a nice succinct summary that clearly sets out your aims and what you want to achieve. And then what this is trying to do is get you from your current state, that transformation process, into future state. So what I want you to do now, and you may be watching this session on your own, or you may be in a small group or sharing it online as a small group. So what I would like you to do now is just pause, have a moment to reflect. And in the group sessions, I gave teams 15 minutes to just sit and plan and write out your policy statement so that you're really quite clear about what it is you're setting out to achieve, and you're clear about who it's actually for and what you aim to do in it. So, there's the top tips there about focus on your ambition. Make sure you're clear about who your policy is for and who's included in that policy, particularly if you subcontract, what your expectations are of your subcontractors and partners, and of course what your aims are from your policy, and when you're hoping to achieve those. Equally, when you would want to set an ambitious planning cycle for it too. So just spend a few minutes thinking about that, and maybe if you've got time now, just sit and write your policy statement just as a first working draft. So the next part is around the third aspect to consider. So successful practice and exemplars. Focus on what works well and learn from that to create next practice. Scope out what's inside your policy, be clear about what is included and be clear about what is not, and don't feel you need to include everything. As we said earlier, it is about being clear in the beginning about what's in scope and what's not in scope. Consider who your audience is and ensure that what you are setting out to what you're setting out to do can actually be achieved by those it's actually implementing for. Consider the equipment, platform safety. Some of you will be restricted by the equipment that you have. Some of you will be restricted in the platforms you can use. So be realistic in what you're setting out for your intentions, because you may need to take those restrictions into account as well. Work with partners and stakeholders and subcontractors to develop your digital policy. Really important, because if you're putting something into place that's not realistic for a subcontractor and they wouldn't be able to achieve that, then you want to know upfront rather than finding out later. That enables you all to have a level of expectation that can actually end up with some impact measures that will be successful. So think also about how your policy is an enabler for a digital curriculum, not just now, but in the future as well. In your policy, you're setting the parameters, the guidelines, and the rules within that you want your digital curriculum to work. So that's really important to think now how your curriculum is developing and how your digital policy is actually supporting that curriculum development. So, policy implementation. Just have a little moment to consider 3 of the most important aspects when you implement your digital policy. What are the 3 things that you think are really important to enable you to successfully implement your digital policy? Just spend a few moments now, pause for a second, and just think. Write down 3 of the most important aspects when you are looking to implement your digital policy. Okay, hopefully some of these ones are on your list. So when you implement your digital policy, communication. This one did come up in one of my groups and everybody said, yeah, that's really important to communicate to make sure that staff and learners understand what their role is in implementing it, as we said before. Staffing and resources, ensure that you can support the implementation effectively. The guidelines that you've set out, the ambitions that you set out, just make sure that they can be adequately resourced and staffed. Training and support, ensure that you've got training in place to support staff in its implementation. Decide on your actions that you're going to need to put into place, keep them realistic and achievable. Then you can develop your action plan and set out what's going to be achieved, by who and by when. When things start working and you see successes, make sure you celebrate them and learn from what's worked well, and also those things that aren't working so well, so that you can then review and decide for yourselves what you'd need to change. So regular review, but obviously that's going to be within your own cycle, but don't leave it too long between reviews, particularly when implementing your policy initially. So the next thing to consider is measuring the impact of your policy, your digital policy, and thinking about performance measures that would help you demonstrate the impact of your digital policy could include, and it might not, but here are just some potential measures you might want to think about. Has your digital policy tried to keep people connected in their learning and work? Has it actually increased learner participation? Has it extended the reach of your learning? Are you now reaching more learners as a result of your digital policy than you would have done before? Have you managed to reduce digital poverty and the digital divide through the implementation of your digital policy? Have you successfully created safe and healthy learning and work environments through the guidelines and the rules and the standards and the framework within your policy? Have you managed to reduce social isolation, reached new learners? Have you reduced digital skills gaps? What about supporting the implementation of your new digital curriculum? Has it enhanced that? Has it helped that? Has it improved attendance, retention and achievement? And here we had a really big discussion around, well, would that be double counting? And can you really say that your digital policy has had an impact on these things, or is it other factors? And of course, there could be a combination of factors that have led to some of these things. But if you have specific things within your digital policy that are really circling around some of these areas, you may well be able to use that evidence. You'll need to decide what's right for your context when you're putting in place measures. These are just some examples to start the thinking, and you may have more, you may have different ones. And there may be less measures as well, but it's really about thinking about what's right for your context and what you want the impact to be and what you want the outcomes to be from the implementation of a digital policy. So that's it for this session. Just want to check in with you now to see how you feel now about when you're drafting your current digital policy. How confident are you in implementing it, and maybe considering some of the actions that you would need to deliver your digital policy? And how confident are you now in demonstrating the impact of your digital policy? Well, hopefully you've had some time to think through some of the issues. Perhaps you might want to go away and reflect a little bit more, put some of these things into place. You might want to start drafting it and then return to this session again for some further pointers as well. And you may just want to start reaching out to your peers to see what they've got in place. But don't forget, you've got all of the resources that have been included in the Digital ACE project. There are exemplars within the packs. There's more materials. There's a whole pack on this that you can access so that you can reflect on other people's learnt experience as well. So hopefully this session, we were trying to identify what's important to include. Hopefully we've identified some of the things that are important to include and given you a little bit of space to think about what's important for you to include. Hopefully we've been able to consider the actions that are required when you implement your digital policy too, and some of the ideas that you'll need to just reflect on when you are implementing it for its to get the biggest success. So the final thing was how you start capturing the impact of your digital policy. Obviously, if you're in the early stages of that, you may not be able to capture much at the moment, but if you think through the impact you're trying to have in the beginning, at least you're getting to the point where you have measures in place ready to assess against the impact of your digital policy when it's time for you to start capturing that information. Don't wait until the end, or don't wait until your annual cycle to see if it's having an impact. Review and look at the impact your digital policy is having and try and put those measures in place as you're writing your policy, and always keep that end goal in mind. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in and for your participation. And hopefully you will have got some useful pointers in your journey towards implementing your digital policy, and in seeing the impact that it has over time on making a real difference in your organisation and for the learners that you serve. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.